Okay, today we're going to reinstall the carburetor on a motorcycle. Okay, so I took the carburetor apart and cleaned it out. Had the starter jet here, took it out. It has a relatively large orifice, so you just unscrew it using a good quality flathead screwdriver. And you just want to blow carb cleaner through it and make sure that you can see daylight through it when it's unscrewed. I also had a look at the starter jet. It's very, very fine, so again I blew carb cleaner through it and made sure I could see daylight through that jet when it was removed. And then I took out the main jet and the needle jet here, so you again use a high quality flathead or a wrench to remove this, and you just spray carb cleaner through it and make sure that you can see daylight through it. And again, you'd use a Japanese industrial standard screwdriver to unscrew this pivot for the floats. And on the floats you've got the float valve and the valve seat, and in there was where I found my problem. The valve seat had a bunch of debris under it, a bunch of scale, and it was restricting fuel from coming in through the fuel inlet here into the float valve. And that was problematic because when the floats go down, they lift up this needle, or not the needle, sorry, the float valve, and the debris was obstructing fuel flow into the bowl of the carburetor. And by cleaning that out, hopefully we'll be all set. I also cleaned out the air jet, which is located there. And again, the throttle slide on this slides freely, and I made sure that the needle was clean as well. I wouldn't unbolt the butterfly. It's difficult to set back in place, but I cleaned it off, but I didn't unbolt it. Then I used some compressed air and made sure I was able to get, make sure everything was nice and clean after spraying it with carb cleaner. I don't know if you can see, but on this fastener here there's a dot on the top, and that identifies it as a Japanese industrial standard. And again, you want a JIS, Japanese industrial screwdriver, for undoing Japanese industrial standard screws. Looks like a Phillips, but if you use a Phillips you run the risk of damaging it. So again, my problem was found, the fuel inlet. Debris had made its way into the valve seat, and it wasn't letting fuel in through the valve to fill up the bowl of the carburetor regularly. So now we're going to reattach the carburetor bowl. It's got 4 screws. Again, Japanese industrial standard. And with these U-screws, it's a little harder to see the dot on there, but there is a dot. And again, the dot identifies as a Japanese industrial standard, but being a Japanese motorcycle, you don't have to guess. It's going to be a Japanese industrial standard fastener. And again, with the Phillips, it was designed to pop out when it was torqued. But if the fastener ever gets seized in place through age, then undoing it is a problem, because the Phillips will then have a tendency to pop out. But the Japanese industrial standard has resolved that by having a different profile on the head of the driver and the screw. Even though they look very similar, they are in fact different. So I'm just tightening the bowl in a cross pattern here. Like the jets, you don't want to go ridiculously tight. The jets in particular, because they're made of a softer brass, or they're just made of brass, which is a soft metal. And so if you go really tight, you could damage them, but you still want them to be tight. You just don't want to go like ridiculously tight. And there we go. Float bowl's reattached. Next step is to reinstall the carburetor in the bike. Okay, now installation is reversive removal, but let's go through it. So we're going to put parts back on the way we took them off. So the strain hose I removed, so we'll put that back on, like so. And then we also had the overflow on the carburetor, so we're going to put that back on. So if the carburetor ever overflows, the fuel won't flow down onto the hot engine, it would run to the rear of the motorcycle. Then we're going to take the rag out of the intake, and then the next step is to maneuver the carburetor back into the boots. Now, this is a bit tricky because we haven't taken the airbox off, but since it's a single carburetor, we should be able to rotate it into the airbox boot and then slide it into the intake boot. So there we go. We've slid it into the airbox and then positioned it into the intake boot in the engine. So just give it a couple twists so it seats nicely. And there we go. Now we're going to want to make sure that we're fully seated at the front here. So you'll want to have a look at the boot here and here and make sure that it's as far forward as we can get. And then in the rear, we want to make sure that the rear boot is also seated. Okay, the next step is we're going to reinstall the throttle cables. So this throttle cable has a knob on the end that can slide into this butterfly plate. And so we're going to slide it in, and then there's a groove that the cable sits in. It's easier to get it out than it is to get it in, but there we go. That one's in, and then we're going to take this other cable and install it, but first we're going to reinstall this plate here. So we've got the two screws. The countersink screw goes in the bottom, and we'll get our trusty JIS screwdriver. And we'll thread that in. Whoops. There we go. And then we'll get our second screw. And we'll install that. Okay, so we'll tighten in the top screw, and then we'll tighten in the bottom screw. And again, it's really important to use the JIS in these screws because the Phillips would really damage these screws if they've been exposed to the elements. Okay, now we're going to take our second throttle cable, and you'll see this little hash, that goes to the outside. So we're going to rotate the cable around, we're going to slide it into its notch there, and then the cable slides into that groove, and you just pull it upwards, and then we'll put the cable into its slot. Okay, now we're going to retighten the throttle cable, and again, we want to put it back where it was. You don't want the throttle cable to bind, because that's very problematic. You could be stuck in a full throttle situation, which is no good. You could be out of control, so that's not great. But fortunately, the top part is captive, so there really isn't a lot of risk of getting this too far out of adjustment, but it is possible, so it's something to pay attention to. So in this case, we have a 10mm wrench to lock it in place, and it does have a lock nut at the bottom, but it seems to be really good about keeping its position because it's got a nice lock plate here. So you want to test your throttle, so we're going to twist the throttle now, and we want to make sure that it returns back nicely. Now that one's not quite right. Okay, so the throttle is a little slow to return, so we're just going to grab the bracket. We're going to loosen it a bit here. There we go, and then we'll just retighten it. And again, the carburetor hasn't been tightened into the boots yet, so it's still a little loose, but there we go, let's try that. Great. So that's what you want to see. Nice sharp return. Yep, and then no harm in adding a little bit of lube to the end of the throttle cables and making sure that this is lubricated as well. But that's what you want to see. You don't want it to see it like bind up like that. That's no good. You want to see it return nicely like that. Okay, next step is to make sure that the carburetor is fully engaged in the intake boot. So you just want to give it a push forward and make sure it's good. And then we're going to tighten up this hose clamp right here. We want to make sure this is nice and tight because we don't want the carburetor to become disengaged from the intake boot. And it's not a bad idea to have a look at the boot and make sure it's not cracked or damaged. And on older bikes you might find that there is some damage to the boot. And you want to be careful taking the carburetor out if the boot is damaged, because if the boot's quite brittle, taking the carburetor out might be the last straw. Great, so that's nice and tight. Okay, and once the carburetor is seated in the airbox boot, we're going to tighten up the hose clamp for the airbox boot. Okay, now we're going to reinstall the choke plunger. So you just slide this choke plunger back into the hole in the carburetor, and you just thread in the choke plunger connector. There we go. Thread it in by hand, and then we'll do the final tightening with a 14mm wrench in this case. There we go. So we'll plug the fuel line back into the carburetor, pushing it all the way on. And then we've got this pinch clip. So a simple pair of pliers. We'll pinch the clip and slide it back into place. Now this particular carburetor has a vacuum to let the petcock release fuel into it, but it also has a prime position. So we're going to turn the petcock to the prime position now, and with the petcock in the prime position, it should fill the bowl of the carburetor. Okay, and last but most certainly not least, is we have to take the vacuum line from the carburetor and attach it to the back of the petcock. Now remember, this vacuum line, when the engine's running, will create a vacuum to allow the petcock to open up and allow fuel to flow into the carburetor. And once that's on, then we can test fire it and see how we did. Okay, and now we'll test fire the bike. Okay, so it seems to idle fine. Just check for leaks, make sure everything's nice and dry, and then that would be job done. Thanks for watching.